Okay, so this is a former keynote, and it's pretty much Fed heavy because I wanted to sort of ask people what they've seen, what has changed over the years for them, things that they'd talked about previously in their keynotes. Looking back now, were they accurate, were they inaccurate, where'd they screw up, and what'd they get right? Where do they see going forward? And since information security seems to be moving really quickly nowadays, and we are really in the spotlight, we're getting a lot more attention than ever before. I think that's sort of a blessing and a curse. Maybe a curse in the sense that if everybody's hanging on every word you say, if you say the wrong thing, it's like, finally, this is my day in the sun, and you try to do everything in 15 minutes that you wanted to do for 15 years. That you're setting yourself up for disaster. So I think we have to be more careful now than ever before in how we portray ourselves and kind of the things we're saying. We've got their attention. Now we have to decide what to do with it. So let me start at the end with Tony Sager to introduce himself.
Sure.
Why don't you just take some time, talk about maybe your perspective a little bit, and then we'll move into a more conversational.
Okay, do you want just an intro first? Or what
Well, talk about your intro. Just let's do intros first, and then kind of give more in depth.
We'll do. Okay, good afternoon. My name's Tony Sager, and as of September, I'll be a 34-year veteran of the National Security Agency. Thank you. All of it in what we call information assurance today, so in the defensive mission at NSA. And I've spent that 34 years involved in security testing of one type or another, everything from cryptographic algorithms to product testing, and then out to and including operational testing like the NSA Red Teams and so forth. And over the last 5 years, I've had the honor of running the organization that does all that for the defensive mission at NSA. So my perspective is a little warped by having watched things break in a myriad number of ways, and probably the last 10 years of my life have been focused on how do we solve some of these problems that we have seen countless times over and over again. And when we come back, I'll talk a little bit. I was keynote in 2007 and talked about a number of things that we were doing around public standards and guidance and so forth. Thanks.
Great. Next we have Linton Wells.
So my name is Lynn Wells. I'm over at National Defense University, where I run a small center on technology and national security policy. Before that, I spent 16 years in the Office of Secretary of Defense, including a couple of years as DoD Chief Information Officer. I think my first time here was 2000, 2001, and I was just reflecting in the discussions here about not only how much has changed, but how much has remained the same in terms of how much more slowly the government is responding than the threat is evolving. So it's something to talk about.
And finally, we have Bob Stratton.
Hi, I'm Bob Stratton. I'm an independent consultant out of the DC area. More recently, I was Director of Government Research at Symantec. I've done a couple of venture-funded and bootstrap security startups, and was a part of a novel experiment a while back to create a venture capital arm for the Central Intelligence Agency, which is now covering the whole intelligence community. So I guess part of my focus...
You got to talk about your early days.
Oh, well, yeah, there is that. I founded the security organization at UUNet, which was one of the first Tier 1 internet service providers. Had an audit and pen test consultancy.
Yeah, you did the first pure play security practice, the Wheel Group.
Yeah, first network IDS, commercial network IDS, which we sold to Cisco. Then I did a pen testing consultancy, which I sold to Cylink. So I guess I'm kind of the reluctant business semi-fed guy.
Well, and at one point, the one thing I like about Bob is at one point, almost all of Usenet went through his basement. Yeah. So thanks, Bob, for keeping Usenet running for all those years.
Well done. Absolutely.
Yeah, it was heating his house. Okay, so that's your perspectives. And so we'll go back now to Tony. And give you a little bit more time if there's any questions or things you want to flesh out. And then I'll start, we'll do that again with everybody a little bit more in depth now that we know your perspective. And then I'll tease out some questions and we'll open it up for audience participation and we'll just see what happens.
That sounds great, Jeff. Thanks.
So maybe talk a little bit about your previous keynote and maybe what's changed or how you see the role of what you're doing change. And
okay.
We're looking for big picture ideas here.
Well, let me summarize briefly the great opportunity that I had to come out and speak in 2007, both to Blackhat and DEFCON. And in a lot of ways, it was sort of a coming out party. That is, we were really going public with a lot of things that we had been doing. And again, have spent my life in the defensive side of this. And actually, we just celebrated a big 10th year anniversary at NSA. It was June 26th or 7th, I forget exactly when. But 10 years ago, that was summer of 2001, we started releasing to the public security guidance at NSA through the public web presence. And I know that doesn't sound like much today, but that was a real culture changer for us, and convincing some really understanding bosses that I worked for that would be a good idea. That is to take guidance that we had been developing as an outgrowth of red and blue team testing and product testing for the DoD, putting it together in a more general and broadly usable form, and then just giving it away. And what I was seeing at that time, and this is the early 2000s, was, we all talk a good game about public-private partnership, and we're all on the same net, and we're trying to solve the same problem, but there isn't much work that's really aimed at solving the problem together. And the messaging that I was trying to get across was, we're part of the community, we're going to put our share out there for inspection. There were people looking for an NSA backdoor in it. I don't think anyone's found one yet. But the idea
was a really good job you did hiding it.
We're incredible, I'll tell you. But the idea was, we have a shared problem, we need to share solutions, and the only way to do that was start putting things out there that we would just give away. And the point I made to my boss at the time, and he strongly endorsed it, was we would be able to gain more influence and cause more positive change by giving things away than we would by trying to gain control of the environment, that is, be in charge of everything. So we had started that in the early 2000s. By 2007, the message that I brought was, this idea of cooperation across the private sector and government, and in particular for the government to bring its share of technical content to the table. And we had started on a massive campaign to start working in open standards for security. So if you ever heard the term SCAP, Security Content Automation Protocols, a lot of that groundbreaking work came from my folks at the time. So how do we take things like good practice, NSA guides, NIST, DISA STIGs, if you know what those are, NIST checklists, I think they call them, and how do we take those and then automate them, right? So the problem that we're having, and one of the many problems we're having in this business, is that we're asking poor, overworked, underpaid humans to manually configure, protect, and deal with things that are just beyond the scope of human ability to manage. So we need to do more things at scale, ask automation to help us, get them directly from the vendor in a more securable fashion than trying to do it in the field. For us, it's the DoD. And so that was the message that I was bringing, and a big part of that message was also, we're not just trying to foist this on you in the industry, but this is what we're going to do to ourselves at NSA. That is, we're going to break down the barriers between things like red teaming and blue teaming and product testing, and use the same standards to create information in the same form so that we could naturally move from detecting a problem to fixing a problem. So that was the message that I brought out here in 2007. It seemed to go pretty well, brought us a lot of new partners, and it gave us a chance to kind of put the case on the table. One of the lessons I've learned over this, I must be the most hopelessly naive guy in the room, but everything that I think could be solved in a year always takes 3. And I'm just learning now to multiply all my estimates by 3, and it's not because people are lazy or don't care, it's because many of these things are really, really complicated. That is, we've got a lot of problems to solve, and they're not conceptually as hard as they are, in our terms, operationally hard. If you're trying to do something on the scale of a DoD, there's just a lot of things that have to go right, everything from money to acquisition to training to technology. And you can't ignore any one of those kinds of things. So that was the message of the time.
Now, what would you say,
Yes.
Did you take any lessons away from your speech at DEFCON? Were you received positively, negatively? Did you think that you were a leper back at work for coming out? And
Well, it took some convincing, right?
Imagine.
But number one, the reception at both Blackhat and DEFCON was just overwhelmingly positive. Really, this idea of community and working together. People, I think, weren't used to hearing that message as directly from the government. On the government side, it is complicated also, though. That is, so here's a premise that I have. I know you'd appreciate this, Jeff. I mean, the world that we're living in, right? We're all using the same technology, good guy and bad guy. We're on the same network, good guy and bad guy. Anything like the DoD, any enterprise is now hopelessly dependent upon all its partners and suppliers, right? They're in your network, they're part of your supply chain. So the world is very deeply connected in a lot of ways. So the lesson for me that sometimes I have to work to get people to understand, is that there is no boundary to something like the Defense Department, right? There's no network perimeter, there's no boundary. I mean, we have perimeter devices and all that, sure, but the perimeter really doesn't exist in the way we would like to think of it. And so, because of all these factors, you can't secure the DoD, right? You can't make it better without everybody getting better. I mean, everyone has to get better. And that's not a bad thing, right? That's exciting and positive. But here's the real test. This is a test of kind of culture and where you come from. At the end of that sentence, I would put comma, everyone has to get better, including the bad guys. Right? If you're really going to reshape the industry, have standards for security, improve the content, that's the technology that everybody's using.
When the water rises, even the bad guys' boats rise.
Yeah. So learning to operate, from our perspective in the DoD, in such a complex environment, I think is one of our great strategic challenges. So that's the lesson for me, is to kind of, how do we think about this differently than, there's no neutral ground between us and them, right? We're really all connected in a deep way that is just hard to, that I don't think we can extricate ever again. So, thanks.
So, in about 1997 or so, I was with Lou Gerstner, then head of IBM, on a panel. Can you hear me in the back okay? Yeah, on a panel, and he was asking, how do I know if I have an effective information assurance program? And the answer was, walk down the hall, find a random employee, ask them 3 questions. Would you know if your computer is being screwed with? If yes, would you know who to call to get help? If yes, would you care enough to call? And the point was, unless you can answer yes for all 3 questions for all your employees, you can spend all the money you want on technology and you're going to fail on the people side. And this has struck me as an area where the government in particular needs to put a lot more emphasis, not just on building the high-tech team of cyber defenders or warriors, whatever, but convincing the entirety of the workforce, and the leadership, that these are issues for commanders and policymakers and decision makers, not just for the techies, and they have to be part of what permeates our day-to-day operating procedures. So I was really encouraged to see this defense strategy for operation in cyberspace that was rolled out a couple of weeks ago, and I realized there were various critiques of it, but it does include much more emphasis on the entirety of the DoD workforce becoming more aware and more capable in cyberspace, and linking that to R&D. So if there's anything I'm cautiously optimistic about, it's that. Another thing, though, is that one of the things that's always struck me when I've come to DEFCON is the enormous amount of talent and energy and enthusiasm that's here in this room. And I've never regarded this as a we-they sort of thing, in the sense of, as I would love to get people here to work more closely with the government. My point has always been, as long as you haven't crossed the line, some line of felony conduct, we'd love to work with you. And every year people come in and submit resumes, and last year I was out here in the Air Force, I think had ability to hire 50 people out of the audience. So I think this has been a change over time, is the government becoming more recognizable. We don't have all the answers. You guys have a lot of the answers. How can we tap and work together on it? So I think that's the hardware has come and gone, the gig, the higher walls and wider moats with angry alligators, the perimeter fences has fallen by the wayside. But this business of people and the emphasis on partnership, I think, is one of the things I've always found valuable here.
Okay, Bob.
So I was trying
That's a tough act to follow, huh?
Yeah, it really is. I was trying to remember the first time. Well, I think we met at DEFCON 3?
No, we met at a PumpCon.
Oh, there you go. And probably in a parking lot somewhere. But I think around 94, 95, I was here, and I was had the unique perspective of being the guy at a pretty big ISP who saw what was going on. And I always kind of called it the Wild West, because there really weren't a lot of rules yet. In fact, there weren't even a lot of laws yet to deal with what was going on out there. But at the same time, I was always sort of inherently optimistic that it would somehow be okay. And some of that meant there would be new products and new services that would try to help people protect themselves, and that wound up becoming an entire industry sector. But also that people would kind of try to help each other in the process of figuring out how to make all this stuff work together. And I think what's one of the more interesting things that we had seen back then was that some of the groups that were doing standards work weren't doing it in quite as, have to be diplomatic here, bureaucratic a way as some of the traditional standards bodies. And I remember this one phrase that sort of told me that I was in the right place, which is from the Internet Engineering Task Force. They said, "We reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code." And I thought, wow, I like these guys. I can work with this. But then I was getting phone calls at 4 o'clock in the morning when people were being hacked all the time. And it was sort of newsworthy, but people didn't even know to talk about it yet. It was so weird and unusual, it wasn't newsworthy yet. But as time went on, I realized that, the internet is not a good place or a bad place. It's like the street. Good things, wonderful, miraculous things happen on the street. People save each other's lives, people meet and get married, wonderful things happen. But there are alleys that are kind of bad. And it doesn't make the whole place bad, it just makes some neighborhoods kind of bad. And that has always sort of informed my perspective, and I've tried really hard not to color it. And I look back now, having spent some time trying to work with some of the folks addressing the government's concerns about some of these things, and then also working in one of the bigger companies that tries to build products for that.
Yeah, when you're at Smith.
And I realized that it's still pretty much like the street, but the good news is the citizenry have gotten more savvy. And that I think my optimism has not been misplaced. That some of how we thought we would deal with these things is different than what we expected. In fact, I don't think when I started I would have ever expected the folks at Fort Meade to be producing really good, readable guidance about how to do things like configure commodity operating systems that you could buy, off the shelf. And I thought that was awesome, but I tell you, I never would have predicted that. So I look back and I think that, if you look at the history of this conference and its sister conference, part of why things have been manageable and part of why things have continued it's bad out there sometimes, but we get better, even if some of the individual problems get worse, is because we've created environments where people can talk to each other. And I remember DEFCONs where there were no feds that admitted to being feds until someone pointed them out in the crowd. And
yeah,
you could probably count the total number on a hand.
Well, and the very first Fed that I spotted, I didn't spot, he came up and revealed himself at the end of the first DEFCON. And he said, I'm from the Secret Service, and I just wanted to say hi. And I wanted to say hi, Sunday evening after everybody was gone. But I had invited the Secret Service, and they were saying, no, we can't comment, we can't be there officially. That sounds like policy, and we're enforcement. And so, if you want somebody to show up officially, just talk to, the administration, not us. And but they still sent somebody, and that gave me the idea for Spot the Fed. Actually, it's like, okay, so if you are going to show up, we're going to, make it a little bit more fun. Okay, so we kind of know their perspective, where they're coming from. So I want to open up to the audience and see if anybody here has any questions. You want them to look forward, backwards, point fingers, whatever you'd like. So there's a microphone right here. All you got to do is come up to it and say who you are, where you're coming from, what you want. So take it away.
Hi, my name is PowerCycle. I've worked for two of the biggest DDoS defense companies in the U.S. I've stopped more than like 500 different attacks. And what I wanted to ask about is cyber war.
Can you speak just a little bit better in the mic?
Okay.
Yeah, it's down a little low.
Okay. What I wanted to ask about is the term cyber war. And in past DEFCONs, the term has been actively in the titles, and it doesn't seem to be in the titles now, which I'm happy about. Specifically because, first off, the term cyber is kind of a punchline and a joke in this community. And I can see how, outside to others, to the press and everything, you can use the word cyber and it doesn't really hurt anybody. But when you start to talk about war and it's paired with a joke, I think it's really detrimental to the United States. So what I wanted to ask you is, what's the difference between espionage and cyber war? And do you think that by continually using the word war in releases from the military, from the NSA, from the president, or from anybody in the government, do you think that leads us down the wrong path where you're not stopping thievery and bullying by overusing military might and then just in the end crushing American freedom and not really even solving the problem?
Okay, so a pretty broad question, but Linton will start off.
Well, I think if you look at the statements that Deputy Secretary Lynn and General Cartwright made in the rollout on July 14th, the cyber strategy, they went way out of their way to avoid the discussion of war and to be, to caution people against using words like cyber attack when there's no distinction between somebody's being pinged or whether you're actually implanting malicious code or whatever. So I think they were trying to walk back from the characterization. I wouldn't count DOD as being the principal proponent of the term cyber war. In fact, I think there's a discussion that basically says espionage, whether in cyberspace or anywhere else, has been going on among states for a long time and is likely to continue. Take that off the table as a distinct issue. The question here is, at what point do the consequences of some kind of an attack mounted through cyber means lead to loss of life, destruction, whatever, that becomes serious enough to be considered? But the generic sort of easy flow of cyber war is not something DOD is using at all. A lot of people are using it about DOD, but I don't think you're finding that from the official spokespeople.
Didn't in the release, basically, the United States say that a cyber attack on the United States would be retaliated against?
I think they were very ambiguous. They were consciously ambiguous in the response.
Why not be specific?
Because one of the things one tries to do is to impose an uncertainty in the mind of from a deterrence point of view, against those who may wish you harm. And in addition, the act of declaring war is a very complicated activity in the United States. You have all sorts of different people to get involved, and you're not just going to go in and say, this is it, we're going to do it. You've got all attribution.
Isn't that just what we did in Tunisia?
Pardon me?
Isn't that what we're doing in Libya, I mean?
So let's just stay in cyberspace, right? I'm not going to get into a big discussion about U.S. policy. I'm just saying that in the case, they were very clear in the discussions on July 14th about not being explicit in their red lines as to where what a cyber attack, what would constitute various acts, but also to reserve the right to respond through a wide variety of means if the level of damage warranted it.
Well, it's sort of like, let's say you attack the United States with, I don't know, a biological weapon. That doesn't mean we can only respond with biological weapons. We don't have any.
Right, but
so is that
that's an
getting
actual
like
physical attack where people actually get hurt in the sense of stealing a bunch of data from a corporation or from a government department.
Right.
There's no actual death. And
when you started your question on the cyber war versus the terminology and the definition, I think that's what we'll stick with, otherwise the conversation will explode. But from my perspective, and I'm not really a panelist, so I'll just be short, it's that for me the language informs decisions, and if the language is warlike language, it sort of leads you down mentally a warlike path. And that's why I find it interesting the language that people who write about the DOD and the military always tend to stick the word war in there. Yeah. But when people write about sort of civilian and companies being attacked, it's always like cyber thugs and cyber criminals, organized crime, because they're taking a law enforcement mentality. And the law enforcement mentality always is sort of like block watches and community watch and ground up and, you know, watch out for your neighbor and lock your doors. And the military mentality is, it's much more, you know, very command and control. So I think you're seeing the people who write about both areas are now having to somehow reconcile that, and it's interesting to listen to the vocabulary, because it's changing. There's a reason why you don't see a lot of talks that say cyber war at DEFCON anymore, because everybody realizes that's kind of nonsensical, and they're starting to sound dumb if they put that in their titles. So I'll let Tony respond, and then we'll move on to the next question. Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, just a word or two to echo Dr. Wells. I mean, and I don't think you'll see that kind of language. You know, the war has a particular meaning in the Defense Department.
Yeah.
That leads us to places that, you know, no one's going right now. I will say that I'll just comment briefly on your the use of the word cyber, though. You made a comment about that. I was in a room full of defense contractors, and I said, okay, everybody raise your hand if you have a gigantic room full of fancy screens and blinking lights, and the name cyber is somewhere, the phrase cyber is somewhere in the name of that room. And all the hands go up. And I said, and then how many of you, a year ago, that room had the name IO, or Information Operations, in the title instead of cyber? And most of the hands stay up. And I said, and then 2 years before that, how many had that same room, but the title Computer Network Operations was in the title, the phrase was in that title instead? And sheepish hands are still kind of hanging around. You know, it's people kind of gravitate to the buzzword of the day because that drives attention, funding, you know, and so forth. And it is overused. There's no question about that.
Do you want to say something,
Yeah,
Rob?
just real quick, and I have no affiliation with these guys, but I recently discovered a site called something like, if I use the prefix cyber, will it make me look like an idiot.com? And there's this great sort of expert system decision tree, and it's like, are you trying to get money from this particular type of customer? And it walks you through these decisions, and it gives you kind of probability ratings of how much of an idiot you'll sound like if you use it. And one of the questions, qualifying questions way down in there is, are you preparing a presentation for the US government?
Yeah.
So you're not alone in asking that. Now I know why they're all so consistent.
They're all so consistent because they use the site, right?
So just to amplify that one more time, we had a conference on cyber something in DOD, and about 150 people in the room. And my question was, all right, how many of you are under 35? It's like 7 hands go up. And so the question was, okay, you know, what questions should we be asking here that we're not? And a 20-something-year-old lieutenant got up and said, well, you know, nobody in my generation uses the word cyber. We may be connected, we may be online, we may be LinkedIn, maybe whatever, but cyber is just not a term that's part of our vocabulary. And so if you're building all this great vocabulary around cyberspace and cyber whatever, and a large part of the young people who are operating and they don't really understand what you're talking about, maybe you should give some thought to that. So.
Yeah, well, my problem's not with cyber, it's with war.
And I would just, I think war is not a term the DoD will use in this case.
Next question.
Good afternoon, panel. Can you hear me okay? My name is Joe. I'm from North Carolina. And my question is, if you were to give another keynote speech, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good one.
Another what?
If you were to give another keynote speech, what would it be?
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Actually, a talk that I've given recently is my perspective on what I think the future of cyber defense is going to be about. Okay, so I'll just give you the quick summary of it. And the bottom line conclusion is, I think the key to success in defending ourselves in this mythical cyberspace is solving what I call the massive information management problem. So we happen to be, and here's a quick summary of the talk, we happen to be at a state where the vast majority of problems that plague us today, that cost us money, that bring our systems down, here's the sad news for the defense, right? You all know this. The vast majority of those problems are known problems with known solutions. And that's a pretty sad indictment of our community, frankly. It doesn't, again, it's not an indictment that people are lazy or don't care. It tells you how operationally challenging this problem is, right? So from having a tool to solving a problem can be night and day. But my observation over 30 years of this is, you know, the things that The knowledge that we need to defend ourselves, predict the next attack, minimize the next one, etc., is already out there somewhere. It's just not in the right spot, at the right time, in the right form. And so there's a whole talk that I give that's kind of around how do we organize the way we collect, store, move, query for information that would allow us to understand what the real problem is that we're trying to solve. And we've thought of this too much, I think, as a technology problem. If we could just buy the right thing, then we would be able to defend ourselves. And that's just not going to happen. And it turns out, the term that's used in the intelligence business is, how can I look over the horizon, right? How can I see what's coming? And I only know two ways to look over the horizon. One is have friends who happen to live over the horizon and who are both ready, willing, and able to communicate with you, right, to share information. And not through meetings and not through email, but through technology, right? We can't move it fast enough by calling our friends to warn them. It's just not gonna happen. So you have to have friends that are over the horizon to help you look. And then you have to have an intelligence business, right? You have to be able to look more deeply into what's going on outside of your own boundaries and be able to understand. And we have to remember that bad guys are just like us, they're just bad. That is, their tools don't appear out of thin air, right? They have to conceptualize them, design them, build them, test them, equip them, and all this kind of stuff. And if you can't sort of get in the cycle of understanding that, then you'll never be able to defend yourself. So the bottom line premise for me, and I've given this talk a couple of times, so I'm cheating a little bit on your answer, but if I had another keynote, I'd come back to talk about kind of what I think we need to do around the sort of massive management of information. We have massive amounts that is not available in the right form, in the right place, at the right time, that I think we could manage the 95% of this problem with that. Thank you.
I think I would talk about mission assurance in a time of exponential change, taking into account the behavior of real people. I originally started off focusing on information assurance, but in point of fact, you need to be able to accomplish the mission, irrespective of the level of attack you're under. And my own background is Navy, and you never design a ship with the expectation the water's not going to get inside the hull. So I think we should expect that the systems we're using are going to be compromised in some sense and not maintain this ideal objective of a firm perimeter. And so if the attack is not going to cause you to be operating 100% one day and then 0 the next, it's going to be some kind of a degradation which is going to come back over time. So the goal should be to minimize the depth and the width of that bathtub. And again, to be able to accomplish whatever plan B, C, or D you need to get the mission done. But the point about taking into account real people, one of the things the Deputy Secretary Lynn talked about in his Foreign Affairs article last fall was declassifying the whole buckshot Yankee business with the thumb drives. I mean, that was essentially a case where people were charged with getting the job done and say, fine, I'm going to, the security's too odious for me to get the job done, I'm going to go around it, and got bitten. How do you find a way to balance things that people can? And then the technological change. If you look at a 15-year horizon, and you believe Moore's law at 18 months, so 18 months is 10 doubling, 15 years is 10 doublings, 2 to the 10th is 1024, that's 100,000% change in computing capacity per unit time, per unit per cost in 15 years. Linear projections are just not going to work. And in getting to your person living over the horizon, we just need to be thinking more in terms of that. So.
You have anything to say, Bob? Or do you want to just move on to the next question?
I'll just say, I think for me, the big message that I would probably come out with is that, and I'm saying this particularly in the context of interacting with the United States government in all its many forms, is that change is possible. And it sounds kind of simple, but I was a part of this grand experiment to try to figure out how to get access to early stage technology to a part of the government that felt like they didn't have that the way they did 20 years before, say in the 70s. And you could argue that some of it kind of worked. So I have to do this as a show of hands. How many people here have used Google Earth? Okay. So when I was at this experimental thing called In-Q-Tel, making venture capital investments, we were faced with this problem. How do you take high-resolution imagery, send it over low-speed connections, and render it on commodity computing hardware? Because your alternative is a guy with a mainframe in a basement in an air-conditioned building printing out maps who's nowhere near the guys who need the maps. And I looked at probably 5 different technology approaches to this, and we found this little company that admittedly, ironically, had named itself Keyhole, that had only been used by realtors in California to show houses. And we made an investment. I think it may have been their first round of investment. And eventually Google bought them, and that's called Google Earth. So don't think that things the government is doing to solve hard problems that it has may not directly also address hard problems that we all have. And so one of the messages I had to take into them was, your problems are not that special sometimes. And if you persist on believing they're special, you're going to get solutions that are only good for you, which means they're going to be expensive and you're going to be the only customer and that kind of thing. And the message I took to everybody else was, they're not that weird and the things that will help you will help them too. And I would argue that at least a little bit of change happened there. And there have been a couple of other examples too. So I would say change is possible would be the next keynote.
Do you have a follow-up comment?
Just to reinforce that point, yesterday and the day before I was over in Camp Roberts in Central California, where we do quarterly field experiments around geospatial information. And the whole 2 days that I was there, one of the tracks was spent on a discussion with National Geospatial Intelligence Agency on how to get imagery released to people who need it in time. And this was 100 questions about, well, what about the, how would the companies who sell us the imagery at very preferential rates feel about the downstream use of vector imagery, vector products that may have been released to somebody in a disaster for 30 days and then afterwards it gets sold, things like that. And it was just, and the whole point at the end of that was we actually got a whole batch of like 30 different lawyers to agree. Astonishing. And you lock them in a trailer in the desert and open the door, they come out. But anyway, that this was a way forward that more and better product could be released more quickly to the public. So I agree with him. Change is possible. It often appears to be slow, but if you go back and look to 2000, an enormous amount has changed. So.
Next, thank you. Next question.
Hey there. I'm CZ. Oh, bend down a bit. My name is CZ, and I've got a question for you about threat profiles and how they've been changing recently. I've kind of been around the block, and we've done with the standard, amateurs, professionals, nation states, that sort of thing, giving us trouble. And as of late, we've seen a new thing come out, which is, one might call it position-based, i.e., I don't like your position, therefore, I'm going to, it used to just be I'm going to randomly clug you. But now it seems to be moving into I'm going to raise $1 million on, whatever, and then fund some real attacks against you. So what do you see in the future as the impact of money on these sorts of threats?
Sort of
and
like,
as more money pops in, where do things go?
Sort of like a crowdsourcing enough nickels and dimes to get a war chest.
Yeah, here's $5. Get everybody here to give me $5, and now I've got a lot of money. So how does that start changing the threat profile from the standard one that I've been dealing with for the past 15 years?
Good question. Very good. And with that question,
well, I'll take a stab at it. I'll put my former Symantec guy hat on. We actually did a study for a year when I was there looking at the underground economy and actually quantifying, in some cases, the value of inventory that some of these people had and were trying to sell and that kind of thing. And there are viable markets and they scale really nicely, which is perhaps not a good thing for us, but it gives you food for thought. I think that there have been pecuniary motivations for malicious software and computer intrusions for a really long time. It's really important to remember the Pakistani brain virus, which many in this room will not remember. And I don't even remember what year. What was that? 87 or something?
Well, I think Miko Hyponen just did a talk on the 25th anniversary of the first virus.
It was basically these guys who ran a computer repair shop in Pakistan who wanted to drive business to themselves. So they wrote this virus. And so you can argue that in some ways the monetary motivation has really not changed. It's just scaled up. At the same time, there have been defacements and message-oriented attacks.
Digital denial of service sit-ins against the WTO.
Right, for a really long time as well. I mean, we were seeing some of that, like when I was at UNet in the early 90s, I mean, there were people starting to do some of those things. So I think the difference really is just, it's like any other industry that matures. You know, you can look at the history of any industry, you look at the history of air travel, right? It matures, there are sketchy aspects to it along the way, both in terms of who's providing services, in terms of who's using services. And I think that this is, I guess from my perspective, is like the street. We don't think much when we see graffiti on the street. I mean, I don't know about most people here, but I see it and I kind of, it's like a fact of life. And I'm not saying these things are good, but I think at some level we still notice these because these are still arguably new to us. I'm not sure that some level of these things won't be noise going forward into the future. We'll just accept them. Hopefully our systems will be built with some minimum level of robustness in the face of them. But in that respect, I'm not sure it's changed that much.
We'll move on. If anybody else has a comment, we've got only about 5 or 10 minutes left for questions. I want to get through the remaining folks here. So if Linton or do you have any comments on the last question?
No.
Nope. Go to the next one. Okay.
Yes. So I think we've all seen a sort of a degradation of privacy over time, and obviously the technology has changed and technology keeps changing faster and faster. But I was wondering if you each see a possibility of having a world where we still have privacy and security at the same time, or if it's one or the other, and we're just, you know, going from having a lot of privacy to having none.
Thank you.
It seems to me that one of the privacy questions, and I've got to tread very carefully in this as a Govy, because clearly we're committed to for a whole variety of laws and ethics around privacy, but the concern to me in privacy is the extent to which we're all giving it away in the interest of commercial gain, I mean, or convenience or whatever. We share our locations via our cell phones. You can, there are all sorts of companies who say where this location-based service information is marketed to a department store to know that, you know, on the third floor men's department there are people at 10 o'clock in the morning with an average of 3.4 customers who've driven 6 miles to get there and stay for 13 minutes. But if I offer a 20% sale, I'll get 6 copies. I mean, all that stuff is out there, and we don't seem to be caring about the privacy ramifications of what chicken could come home to roost with that. So, you know, from my standpoint in the government, we will defend very vigilantly the sets of laws and rules we're under. I just worry in the broader societal context about how much this is being undercut by what's happening in
like voluntarily giving away the information.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Voluntary.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I mean, whatever you think of the National Security Agency, you know, folks like me don't stay there because we don't like the Constitution and don't care about laws. You know, we really do. And if you want to hear heated debates about such topics, you know, get inside our borders sometime. But the challenge is the short-term incentive that people have, you know, just to get a sale price or whatever. You know, when you give information away, you sort of give it away forever, right? And the long-term implications are the really frightening part of this, which is you can't pull it back. And I've got 3 kids. I want them to grow up in a world where they feel safe and that their information, they have some sense of control over it. And in a lot of ways, we are giving away control of information at massive scale. So I'm not sure where these are questions for big thinkers about the sociology of the future to talk about. But clearly there's things that we need to do on the technical part of this, right? So that what happens to information, right? That machines, that there's a certain level of due care about the handling of information. That clearly doesn't exist today, right? And so anyone who's, the previous question about hacktivism and political interests, people that have no business having access to information today can do that and cause long-term implications for you as an individual. And we, at least on the technical side, we've got to find ways to manage that much better, that it's just not so trivial to give that away and lose control of it forever. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think these will be the 2 last questions here.
Hi, my question might actually be for the Department of Education, but I thought I'd ask these guys too.
There's an educator.
Basically, back in the day, there used to be things like home ec and driver's ed and things like that you had to do in high school. Is there any push to get things like not cybersecurity, information security or information assurance into the curriculum in schools so that we actually educate the population?
Well, certainly in the STEM education programs, there are a number of efforts. And if you've seen that, you've got DEFCON kids here aimed at 8 to 16-year-olds. So I think there are, but I'm not sure it's anything more than hit and miss, and somebody particularly is interested in doing this. I mean, NSA has the nation has a very robust training project for cybersecurity. I don't know if that really gets to your question about how do I raise a responsible digital citizen through our normal education processes.
Well, there's the NSA Centers of...
Yeah, I'll mention that. And we co-sponsor with DHS a program called the Centers of Academic Excellence in Information Assurance. And I don't know the numbers, but there's 100+ schools that are involved with that. There's, we review curriculum, and they qualify or not under that program. And that started, I think, over 10 years ago. The concern there was both the general education, but also increasing the pool of people that can work in this business. Now, there's a lot of recognition nationally now that the pool of practitioners is just not big enough, right, for the DoD, for private industry, for everybody. And so we both need practitioners, but also general understanding. So there's a number of activities that we're involved with in other parts of government to look at this. There's a number of private sector organizations that have popped up, and the common wisdom is the pool is several multiples smaller than it needs to be. If we can't increase that pool, then we stay at what I would call the cannibalization stage, right, where we're filling our needs by hiring them from the other guy, not by bringing new people into the pool. So we really have to get over that nationally, find a way to increase the number of folks, and we've invested pretty heavily from NSA with other partners across government, but that's been a big success for us. In fact, it turns out, again, I don't know the exact numbers, but I believe most of our hiring of people directly out of school, as opposed to transfers from the military or whatever, most of our hiring is now from those centers that whose curriculum we've worked with them on.
Yeah, I actually attended one, so I appreciate that.
Oh yeah, very good, thanks.
I think you can see. I'm sorry. I think you can also see the DHS trying to struggle with messaging with their Stop, Think, Connect program. So it's, it's entering the consciousness of education and awareness training. But I'm not sure that there's the Cyber Collegiate Defensive, the CCDC cyber challenge for universities to compete as an incentive to give these guys an outlet, a legitimate outlet to compete in attacking. So I think the education system is fractured and they're trying a bunch of stuff. We're sort of in that laboratory phase, I would say.
Okay. My wife and I were watching I think it was the Discovery Channel. We watched, they was talking about this poor community, some part of the world, and they had figured out a novel way to do fishing. They would use kites, and then they would send the kite out and they would drop the bait from the kites and then they would catch the fish. And to me, that sort of is the essence of hacking, using something that, using something in a way that it wasn't intended to be used. And in this case, they were using it to improve their lives. Is there anything that you guys, from your experience or from your insight, can see is there any technologies that you guys can see that can be used, simple technologies, that can be sort of quote-unquote hacked to improve our lives? We talk a lot about information security and people trying to break into things, but what about breaking things to make things?
That would be like maybe like, I don't know, taking a product that does one thing and make it do another, and that other thing happens to be really useful. Yeah.
I mean, there's great stories about people hacking bicycles in Africa to turn them into knife grinding, scissor sharpening, and generators. You pedal and charge people's phones and things like that. So I think the whole issue of hacking equipment is really interesting. To me, in this case, one of the explosively innovation areas that we're going to see is three-dimensional printing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't think, I certainly until the last couple of weeks hadn't begun to realize the potential implication this has, not only in what you can make for what you intended it to, but in this idea of hacking it for unintended uses.
Yeah, the three-dimensional printing stuff's amazing.
It really is.
Yes, yes, we hear you. All right, so with that, I'd like to get a round of applause for the audience, from the audience. And are you guys going to be in the Q&A room for a little bit to see if there's any interest? So there's a Q&A room, of course, following each session. Our speakers will be there for a little bit in case there's any questions. You can follow us. Wait, I've got to go do something. But you can follow the speakers and ask more one-on-one type questions with them if you'd like. And then
down the hall, almost all the way, second to last room on the right.
Down the hall, second to last room on the right, or you can just follow the speakers. So again, thank you very much, and I'll see you around at the con. Have a good adventure here this weekend.
Before you go, the blood drive tanks were full in 1 hour.
Oh.
We overwhelmed them. They have no idea. And there's a 12-page list of people who are coming back to get blood and marrow. So you guys rock.
Wow.
Thank you.
Wow.